This is the story of how the most connected world in human history fell apart, and the 400-year silence that followed. In 1177 BC, tin from Central Asia moved through Syrian ports. Copper from Cyprus crossed to the Egyptian delta in cedar-built ships. Hittite kings wrote diplomatic letters to Mycenaean ones. Cities of 50,000 people stood from the Nile to the Aegean, linked by trade routes and treaties centuries in the making. Within 50 years, almost all of it was gone. It is the late 12th century BC on the Syrian coast. In the great trading city of Ugarit, a port of perhaps 8,000 people, with palaces, scribes, and a harbor full of ships. The king is writing a letter. He writes to the king of Cyprus, "Enemy ships have appeared. 7 of them have burned villages along the shore. The Ugaritic fleet is away, fighting somewhere off the Lycian coast. The army is in the Hittite mountains. There is no one left to defend the city." The letter is pressed into damp clay in the slanted wedges of Ugaritic cuneiform. It is filed in the palace archive. It will never be sent. The fires that take Ugarit reach the archive before any messenger does. The clay tablets, unbaked, are hardened in place by the heat. The letter survives because the city does not. To understand what was lost, picture the world that came before. By the 13th century BC, the Eastern Mediterranean had become something genuinely new, a network of major powers in regular, formal contact. Egypt under Ramses II, the Hittite Empire ruling from Hattusa in central Anatolia, Mycenaean palaces in mainland Greece, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, the island of Cyprus, which the Egyptians called Al-Ashia, sitting at the center of the copper trade. They wrote to each other. They sent embassies. They negotiated. The treaty between Ramses II and the Hittite king, Hattusili III, signed around 1259 BC, is the oldest surviving peace treaty in human history. And underneath the diplomacy, the goods moved. Tin from Central Asia, copper from Cyprus, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Nubia, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Badakhshan, 3,000 kilometers away. A bronze sword forged in Mycenaean Greece might contain metal from 4 different continents. You could have called it globalization. They didn't have a word for it, but it was the first one we know of. The strength of this world was also its weakness. Bronze was an alloy of tin and copper, and the two rarely came from the same place. To make bronze in Egypt, you needed metal that had traveled across half the known world, through Syrian ports, Cypriot harbors, Hittite roads. Every weapon, every tool, every piece of armor rested on a supply chain longer than any that had ever existed. The grain economies were similarly stretched. The Hittites, in their high Anatolian heartland, imported wheat from the Levant. Mycenaean palaces ran on a tight system of redistribution, with scribes counting every sheep and every measure of barley. The Egyptians bought timber from Lebanon because they had none of their own. A world this connected runs beautifully when nothing is wrong, but interconnection cuts both ways. If the tin stops moving, if the grain ships do not arrive, if a single major port burns, the failure spreads. The Bronze Age world had no shock absorbers. Around 1200 BC, several things went wrong at once. The first piece of evidence is climate. Pollen cores from the Sea of Galilee and from sediment lakes on Cyprus show, at the end of the 13th century, a sharp and sustained collapse in tree cover and crop pollen. The Eastern Mediterranean was entering a multi-decade drought. Not a bad season, but a structural shift in rainfall that lasted long enough to break a generation of harvests. A Hittite king writes to Egypt almost begging for grain, calling it a matter of life and death. The Egyptians ship the grain. It is not enough. Then, the earthquakes. Across the Aegean, from mainland Greece through the islands to the Anatolian coast, archaeologists have found destruction layers dated to the decades around 1200 BC. Walls collapsed inward. Ceilings fell on cooking pots and skeletons. At Mycenae, at Tiryns, at Medea, the damage is consistent with major seismic events. Not one, but a sequence. Some scholars call it an earthquake storm. Whatever the name, the great citadels of Mycenaean Greece took repeated, severe damage in a short span of years. And then the raiders. In the 8th year of his reign, Ramses III of Egypt, around 1177 BC, fought a massive battle in the Nile Delta. The enemy was a coalition of peoples whose names the Egyptian records preserve, but whose origins are still debated. The Peliset, the Jaker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. The Egyptians called them, collectively, the Sea Peoples. The inscription at Medinet Habu describes them this way: the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once, the lands were on the move, scattered in war. No land could stand before their arms. Egypt won the battle, but the inscription tells us where the Sea Peoples had been before the Delta. They had come down the Levantine coast. They had passed through the Hittite lands. and behind them, the cities had burned. In archaeology, the destruction layer is one of the cleanest signals you can find in the soil. A line of ash, fallen masonry, bodies sometimes left where they fell. The decades around 1200 BC produced these layers across the eastern Mediterranean at a scale unmatched by anything before. Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was burned and abandoned. Troy was destroyed for the seventh time. Pylos in southwestern Greece burned, its palace records baked in the fire. Ugarit burned and was never rebuilt. At least 40 cities show destruction layers from this 50-year window, many of them never reoccupied. But the burnings alone do not explain everything. Some cities were destroyed and rebuilt. Others were simply abandoned. Mycenaean itself was not leveled. It slowly emptied. The palace economy that had counted every sheep simply stopped counting. The scribes left. The clay tablets stopped being made. Within 2 generations, the script the Mycenaeans had used, Linear B, was forgotten so completely that when Greeks began writing again, 400 years later, they would use a different alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians, with no memory that their ancestors had ever read. The best current view is that no single cause brought the system down. Drought weakened the grain supply, earthquakes broke the cities, raids cut the trade routes, and the rigid, palace-centered economies, too brittle to absorb the shocks, collapsed inward. Once the network started to fail, the failure cascaded. The tin stopped moving. The bronze ran out. The grain ships did not arrive. And without the system, the cities had no reason to exist. To stand inside Ugarit in the year before its end would have been to stand inside a city that did not yet know it was finished. The harbor was busy. Ships came in from Cyprus, from Crete, from the Egyptian coast. The marketplace dealt in tin, in olive oil, in dyed wool, and silver. Scribes worked in 3 or 4 languages: Ugaritic and Akkadian for diplomacy, Hurrian for ritual, Cypro-Minoan for foreign correspondence. The kingdom had a merchant class wealthy enough to commission its own private archives. In the king's palace, the surviving letters show a man trying to manage a crisis he cannot quite see the shape of. He writes to Cyprus. He writes to his Hittite overlord. He writes to his commander at sea. The tone in the final tablets tightens. The fleet is gone. The army is gone. The enemy is closer. One of the last letters reads, in part, "The enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my cities and have done evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops are stationed in the Hittite country and that all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself." He is asking for help. There is no help. The reply, if there ever was one, never arrived. The next layer of soil over Ugarit is ash. What followed was the longest dark age in recorded human history. In Greece, the population fell by perhaps 3/4. The great Mycenaean palaces were never rebuilt. Linear B disappeared for 4 centuries. The Greeks of Homer's time, in the 8th century BC, would tell stories of a heroic age of warriors and gold and burning cities. They believed the stories were legend. The stories were memory. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire was simply gone. Their language was lost so completely that when their cuneiform was finally rediscovered in the late 19th century, no one alive could read it. But not everything ended. The Phoenicians on the Levantine coast slipped into the spaces left by the fallen powers and built a new trading world from the wreckage. The alphabet they invented, simpler than cuneiform, learnable in days, would eventually become the writing systems of Greece, Rome, and most of the world that came after. The connected age was over. The next one would be different. The letter from the king of Ugarit was found 3,000 years later by archaeologists. It was lying on the floor of the palace archive, hardened by the fire that had taken the city. The clay had preserved every wedge. The message had never been sent. The ships had never come. The connected world was gone. But the letter, fired by the flames that destroyed it, had survived to tell us it had ever existed.